Welcome back, everybody. I'm Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. And here we are in our museum. We call it the Education Center, which focuses on the biography of the great man himself, George Washington. Our mission here at Mount Vernon, as you know, is to teach people about his life, leadership, and legacy. And today, I'm going to look at a part of his life which is understudied. You know, we think of him as the general in the Revolutionary War, and we talked a little bit about that. We think of him as the first president of the United States. But in fact, one of the most important periods of his life was actually the time in between those. It's a time from 1783 when he gives up his commission and comes back to Mount Vernon at the end of the American Revolution and goes really to the moment he becomes inaugurated as the first president of the United States. In 1789, in April of 1789. So it's a 6-year period of his life. And it's a moment of tremendous upheaval in the United States of America. It's a crisis period. It's a moment in which Americans really have to win the peace of the war that they had fought. What will this new republic look like in independence? How will they survive as an independent country? And of course, they have another revolution, a constitutional revolution, to create a more perfect union. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But a moment, let me catch my breath and just say, you know, how much I appreciate everyone tuning in for these lives and the nice comments you've sent to us. One of the things we're able to do because of the generosity of the Hamill family of Arizona right now is we've been offering a free family membership for people who comment during this live stream on Facebook or ask a question. And then we will randomize the selection of the winner. So please write in with your questions and your comments and continue to like us on Facebook and share the news that Mount Vernon is coming at you live every day at noon. And of course, these conversations can be seen at any time as well at mountvernon.org/digital, YouTube, Facebook, and now on Periscope on Twitter as well. So here we are together. This period in Washington's life is marked first by his retirement and giving up his commission. We talked about that last time. This is the thing that makes him a famous person in the world, not only winning the war against one of the world's superpowers, against Great Britain, but being a general who doesn't seize power afterward. He's not going to be like Cromwell at the end of the English Civil War. He's not going to be like Napoleon in the French Revolution. He's not going to be like Stalin in the Russian Revolution. And he's not going to be like Mao after the Chinese Revolution. He's not going to be like the Castros in Cuba who are still in charge. He, in fact, is going to resign his military commission and go back into the people. And the country is going to be a nation of laws and not of men, is what it would say at the time, a republic. But what does that mean? What does retirement mean for Washington? So he gives back his sword, rides back to Mount Vernon, arrives on Christmas Eve in 1783, and then goes into his retirement. And as he famously would write, so the next few months, if you look at Washington's correspondence, he's tucked in tight here at Mount Vernon. They have a huge snowstorm in 1784 in January. And he writes a wonderful letter to the Marquis de Châteauroux. He's actually the Chevalier de Châteauroux at the time. His good friend, Francois Jean de Châteauroux, who was a French nobleman in the American Revolution, and writes him a great letter in which he says, he describes his retiring of his commission, he describes Mount Vernon. He's all snowed in, so they're all tucked away. But he is looking forward to enjoying his life under his own vine and fig tree. You know, that famous phrase that is invoked in the Hamilton musical. Again, the Hamilton musical keeps coming up. It's such a great way to connect people with this history. In the Hamilton musical song, it's after the farewell address in the presidency where he sings, "I'm going back to Mount Vernon, my own vine and fig tree," yada, yada. And it's really great. I won't sing it now, although it could be really good if I do that. But at any rate, so he's using that phrase though throughout his life. I think he uses it over 40 times in different letters to describe the idea of retirement. He will be under his own vine and fig tree, and he will be away from the bustle of the camp, he says, and the intrigue of the court. So the bustle of the camp, the action of an army in motion, and the intrigue of a court, the politics of vying for power and control that happens in statecraft, in politics. You know, in the American Revolutionary War, he's dealing with the Continental Congress and the officer corps and the state governors and the different committees on safety, and he has to be a political figure. And now he's going to step away from all that and go back to being a rural agriculturalist, a great planter in Virginia. And that's his plan. And he's very forward about this public stepping away. And this will be important as we talk about why he comes back and how he struggles with, he promised the American people he would never take a public role again. How can he come back into power? And we'll talk about that a little bit later today. Okay, so what does he do when he comes back to Mount Vernon? Well, he immediately begins to redesign the landscape, as I talked about in an earlier conversation. In the 1780s is really, when you come to Mount Vernon today, when this horrific pandemic ends and you're able to come back here and celebrate with us at Mount Vernon, that landscape, you see the bowling green in front of the mansion, the walks, the gardens, that's all shaped in his artistic design in 1784 and 5 and 6, when he puts into execution a new design to represent what he calls better taste and Republican values. So a Republican simplicity, but also beauty. He starts bringing in Virginia plants, native plants, and planting them in this incredible bowling green. In fact, we still have the 2 massive tulip poplars that he planted in 1785, or had planted. We always have to remember that the people that labor here were enslaved. Washington was a master designer, but of course other people were doing the labor to implement these designs. Some of them were free contract laborers as well, particularly inside the mansion doing plastering work and that sort of thing. But always when I say he planted these trees, we have to remember that these are enslaved people doing that work. Okay, so that design of the landscape is happening in this retirement period. He really is. He actually does order vines and fig trees on an order from Madeira. So he is taking literally this idea, I'm going to not only talk about being under my own vine and fig tree, I'm going to plant them. And here's an aside, because Matt always makes fun of me from making my asides and going on and on. But here's an aside. So the quote, under my own vine and fig tree, comes from the book of Micah in the Bible, so the Old Testament. And Micah is a prophet, and Micah is talking about the end of days. In the end of days, every man will be under the safety of his own vine and fig tree, and no one will make him afraid. That is an ideal of peace. It's an ideal of a period of peace after tumultuous war. So I think that's one of the reasons that appealed to George Washington, that evocation of that notion that no one will make him afraid, that being under your own vine and fig tree has a sort of peaceful understanding of a life in turmoil that was able to be calm and safe forevermore. So anyway, that's the aside. So he's planting his own vine and fig trees here at Mount Vernon. He's redesigning the estate. He's finishing the inside of the mansion. The new room has to be plastered and all that. But he also immediately, really, within 6 months, he goes on another trip. He goes out west to visit his western lands, which have been neglected for 9 years, essentially. He hasn't been out there really since the early 1770s. So it's likely more than that, actually. It's more like over a decade. And he has land not only in the western part of Fairfax County. Mount Vernon is, down in the southeastern part of the county, and it's a very big county. He follows the Potomac River on its northern border. And on that Potomac River, as it goes off into eventually West Virginia, he has land along the different way. He's got settled land with a grist mill that he rents. He's got other farms that he rents out to people. And then he's got less developed land the further he gets west. And by the far west, he's got land into what's now Kentucky and certainly parts of West Virginia. And this is land that's more hypothetical than real. He has deeds to thousands of acres, but he really has never seen it. And it's not even clear who might be living on there. Are there Native Americans living there? Are there squatters living there? He doesn't know. And it's a really eye-opening voyage for him. And it's going to be crucial for our understanding of why Americans come together to create a new country. Because what he finds in the West is, first, he finds lawlessness, and then ultimately he finds chaos. Because first, he finds properties where, first there's properties that have been neglected where he hasn't been receiving his rent, essentially, through long years of war. So he visits with the people that he's partnering with in the grist mill or renting from and tries to get these legal contracts figured out and tries to get some rent payment in arrears. Then he goes to a further stretch and he finds squatters. There's a radical religious sect who has sort of moved out west. And if you think about it, during the American Revolution, over 70,000 white settlers moved from the east into Kentucky from the period of 1775 until 1783. So you're having, even as the American Revolutionary War is going on, you're seeing a massive movement of people, which is creating all sorts of lawlessness and chaos on the frontier. There's very unclear land title. There's constant sort of Indian war happening at a low level of raiding and conflict. And it really is a moment in American history where it's not clear at all how this area is going to be brought into some semblance of government and control. Governments matter. They provide rules of law. They provide courts. They provide stability. And these are things that the West really lacked at that time, even though they had people. So Washington has squatters on some of his land, but he has the legal right to this land, and the squatters have been there. And there are squatter rights. I mean, in common law in the British system, if you've made improvements on land, if you've been living on it for a certain period of time without being asked to pay any rent, you have certain rights. You can't just be abused and thrown off the land. So Washington has arguments with these folks and is trying to come to some kind of agreement. But it's frustrating for him, and it's not clear that he ever makes any revenue from some of these lands that have been improved by other people. And then he goes up, he can't even go further west because the Native American War has broken out. And so here you have George Washington, one of the most famous men in the world, literally, in 1784, out west, in an area where he could be seized by Native Americans who are still being provided by the British with supplies and are hostile to Virginians in particular, but Americans more generally as well. And so he decides it's not going to be safe for him, and he doesn't even go and visit all of his land. And then he actually does an interesting thing. He comes back alone with just himself, and maybe he has a manservant with him, an enslaved man. I don't think he does, but he might do. But he comes back, we would say overland, on a different route. So he went kind of out following the river and then some more established trading paths. And then he just came back basically through the mountains of what's now West Virginia, through Western Virginia, and made his way back to Mount Vernon. So here you have George Washington, who might just randomly show up at your cabin in the middle of Appalachia and say, hey, can I sleep down in your stable for the night? I'm just making my way through. It's hard to know if people would have even known who he was. They would have known he was a gentleman of some note, but there wasn't a lot of images around of George Washington out in the middle of nowhere. He certainly wasn't on the dollar bill. The dollar bill didn't exist. There was no dollar bill yet. I mean, there were continental dollars, but his picture wasn't on them. And they didn't really circulate out in the frontier because they were worthless by this point. So at any rate, it's an interesting thing to imagine Washington showing up at your house, and asking for some food for his horse. And could he bunk the night and then be off in the next morning? It's really quite a remarkable time. Okay, so what happened? So he gets back from being out west, and he keeps a journal. There's a lovely journal of his western voyage you can look at. You can find it on mountvernon.org/digital. Go to the library resources in the Papers of George Washington. You can read his journal from start to finish, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, and I'm not wrong about what happened. But what is cool at the end of that journal is a long statement sort of reflecting on what he learned out west. And what do you think he learned? He learned out west that it was a moment of great chaos. He says the Western settlers are as a pivot, on a pivot, and a feather will blow them which way. How are they going to be connected to the people in the East? All the rivers past the Appalachian Mountains flow to the west. They flow to the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi is controlled by the Spanish at the time. Or they could maybe take their agricultural products and take them over the Great Lakes into the St. Lawrence Valley, but that's controlled by the British. So you have all these people who've moved west. It's nominally American territory, but there's no government there. There's no military. There's no authority. How are these people going to be connected to the people in the East? Especially after, as Washington says, more foreigners come amongst them who have no particular ties of blood or culture or experience of the War of Revolution with the people out west. And so he says, we've got to figure out a way to solve this. And he takes that journal entry and he turns it into a letter that he writes to the governor of Virginia, Benjamin Harrison, who's ultimately related to future President William Henry Harrison and the other president, Benjamin Harrison. But Benjamin Harrison, governor of Virginia, Benjamin Harrison, a friend of George Washington's, receives this letter from the now retired general, and he is advocating the creation of a corporation to improve the navigability of the great rivers that go into the West, the James and the Potomac River. I'm going to take a pause there. Matt, I think, has a question he wants to ask. I'm not going to answer it if it has anything to do with the Constitutional Convention yet. We will get to that.
There are questions. Doug, a question from first grade 1. How many languages did George Washington speak?
Good question. How many languages did George Washington speak? He spoke one language, English, and he read one language, English. He did not have French or Latin, really, anything but schoolboy Latin. And in fact, this was something that he was always very sensitive about. The language that all great military leaders in the European tradition read in the 18th century was French. And so for him to be claimed to be a great military man, he didn't even have French reading, which clearly would set him apart. And he didn't have a classical education. You know, his father died when he was very young, and his family wasn't able to afford for him the gentleman's education of the time, which would include Latin, Greek in some cases, certainly French, and English as well. But so Washington was considered himself a little unschooled at that time. All right, so I'm about to move on to the Constitutional Convention, but let's talk about why that happens, how it relates to George Washington at Mount Vernon in the 1780s. So he sends that letter to the governor of Virginia. I want to create a company, the Potomac Navigation Company, and we got to figure out a way to improve the Potomac River. The Potomac River, Washington knows, goes very far into the west. He knows that there can be portages over into the Ohio Valley that would allow you to connect the folks flowing into the Ohio Valley and beyond to the Potomac. And so they could sell their produce in the east. And so what it needs is a company that'll be able to, blow up boulders in the river, clean out trees, dig out areas, but then also create canals around the different falls. So the Great Falls in Virginia is an area. And so Washington forms a company called the Potomac Navigation Company, and his good friend James Madison helps him in drafting the law that gets passed in the General Assembly of Virginia to create this company. But it's not only in Virginia that they have to pass this law incorporating this company. They have to pass an identical law in the state of Maryland. There is no U.S. Constitution at this time. To get two incorporations in two different states, you need to get two different pieces of legislation passed in the different states. And they do that. They get identical laws passed in Virginia and Maryland. So now this company will go into effect. But what it's created is it's created a governmental challenge, because the Potomac River is officially part of Maryland by all the maps. But if you have a company that has Virginians in it and Marylanders, and they're doing business on the Potomac on both sides of the Potomac, not only on the water, but all around it, they need to have some kind of agreement on how they'll deal with crime on the Potomac River, how they'll deal with piracy, how they'll deal with development. And so both of the states, Virginia and Maryland, create a commission to negotiate a treaty, essentially, between these two states, Virginia and Maryland. And that treaty is meant to meet at Alexandria. But guess what? George Washington steps in, and rather than having the commissioners meet in Alexandria, they meet at Mount Vernon. They meet right here at George Washington's home. And they have an agreement crafted, which is called the Mount Vernon Compact. And this is still a legally binding document between Virginia and Maryland about dealing with some of the rights and rules on the Potomac River. And it was so successful, and James Madison was involved in it, as well as George Washington. It was so successful, they said, well, let's get all the states in the middle of the country together and create a commercial compact like this, where we can clear up some of the rules of how these different states are going to work together. And we'll meet next year in Annapolis, and that's 1786. So in 1786, they meet in Annapolis to have this commercial treaty, but not enough states show up. But who does show up? Alexander Hamilton shows up, and James Madison shows up, and a few others. And they said, well, we can't really do anything because we don't have enough states here, but let's agree to meet again in Philadelphia next year, 1787, and let's agree that we got to convince George Washington to join us, and that way we can have a real deal created. And that meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 is going to go on to become the Constitutional Convention, out of which is going to become a whole new government, let alone a treaty over river rights. So for those of you who didn't know, the Constitution origin comes from Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Compact. The steps come right through George Washington's trip out west, is seeing the problems out west, trying to figure out a way to solve them with a private company. And then as things evolve, a belief that actually there's more problems than just that, and we need a whole new government to run things. So let's talk about that as we transition to the Constitutional Convention. Well, here we are in our Constitutional Convention gallery in the Education Center. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to come here, welcome. And I'd love to talk a little bit about this today. And I'm happy to take any questions about it. The Constitution and the forming of the Constitution is an incredibly important moment to think about right now in America. And in America today, you can see our government is a many-layered government. We speak of the federal government, but what people mean when they say the federal government, they really mean the national government. They mean the government of all the United States. We mean the president and the executive offices and the Congress, and the bureaucracies of the different departments, the judiciary, the rule makers, and the lawyers, and the judges. The federal government is an expression of authority, as well as an idea of a collective manifestation of government. But it's a strange word because, like I said, we mean nation when we say federal in this country, and that goes back to the tradition of the American Revolution and the founding itself. Now, we also, of course, have state governments. So we have the Commonwealth of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the state of Massachusetts and the state of Arizona. And so these states have their own powers within their own localities as well. And then you have local governments and different layers. You have your county governments, or you might have a city council. It all goes back to the different historical origins of the place that you live in. And so in the United States, when we separated from Great Britain, we declared our independence. And in that declaration, it said these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That's the important part of the Declaration at the time of the Revolution. That was the part telling the world that we are no longer under the thumb of Britain. All that stuff about all men are created equal, which we now think of as the most important part of the Declaration of Independence, was sort of a preamble to the main point. It's kind of like we hold these truths, that all men are created equal, they got rights and liberty, and when those are violated, they have a right to overthrow their government. It's a justification for rebellion, but the whole point of the argument is to say these colonies are now free and independent states. That means they have authority over their own domain. They can run the lives of their own people and all the people in their territory. They can tax them. They can form armies. They can do things that sovereign states do in the world. All right. So, but what does that mean? You've got in these United States is that a plural thing? Is that multiple states? We think of the United States today as a nation. We say the United States is. We don't say the United States are. Right, and that's a distinction actually that would have been surprising to people in George Washington's time, right after the Revolution. Now there was a unifying government of them all. So so they declared their independence, and then basically they're independent sovereign entities. Massachusetts can't tell New Jersey what to do. New Jersey can't tell Virginia what to do. Virginia can't tell South Carolina what to do. And George Washington is holding his commission from the Continental Congress, which is essentially an ad hoc, illegal group that came together and decided that they were going to have authority. And their authority basically only rests on the willingness of the states to put up with them and to agree that that's how they're working jointly. So it becomes a de facto, what we would call in political science, a confederation. Right? So it's a confederation. It's a group of independent autonomous states agreeing to come together and compact to do things, to do certain things. And confederations through history can be temporary. They can be something that's meant to come together to deal with the war, like the American Revolutionary War. They can come together to deal with a certain trade agreement with other nations where they all agree jointly to do certain things, but not other things. And confederations imply different levels of autonomy in their units, right? So Virginia and Massachusetts are still independent sovereigns, but they've agreed, for a temporary period to work together, under this confederation agreement. Now, the states finally get together and ratify that agreement in a treaty form as the Articles of Confederation. So when we think of the first national government of the United States together, we refer to the Articles of Confederation, which was written as early as 1777, but not ratified until 1781, if you can believe it. So the Americans basically fought most of the war for independence with no national government, really. I mean, it was all these states agreeing to do this thing, and you had the army, but the actual Articles of Confederation weren't in place until 1781. And the Articles were a very loose alliance of these states. The states retained the vast majority of what they would call their sovereign power. They still could make their own money. They couldn't. The Articles of Confederation couldn't tax individuals. All they could do was ask states to pay a requisition that had been agreed to by the representatives of those states. The states would send as many delegates as they wanted to the Confederation, and the states would vote by state. So if you wanted to pass a law, the Articles of Confederation, each state would have a vote. And there were certain laws you couldn't pass without unanimity. You couldn't amend the Articles of Confederation without unanimity, which means 13 states, all with each had one vote. No matter how big the state was or how important the state was, they each had one vote. And it had very little power, ultimately, to govern the nation. There was no judiciary. There was no real executive authority at all. Essentially, there were a bunch of committees that would deal with the army and whatnot. So after the American Revolutionary War is over, the Articles of Confederation government has some things they need to do jointly. They got to deal with Western territories. The United States owns all this Western land, but each of the states claims it, and it's not clear exactly who's in charge. And so there's this whole process whereby states have to give their land to the government and deal with it. But because they can't tax anyone, the Articles of Confederation can't pay the army. They can't pay anyone. And the United States is bankrupt. And they have no power, therefore, to do any kind of foreign affairs, to make treaties with other powers, to have an army and a navy. All these things sort of disappear very quickly, and the states start acting independently. So, for instance, the state of New York in the 1780s starts passing all these trade and navigation rules on its own. So, it charges different duties for other states to use the port of New York. And New York is one of the most important ports. So they're getting all kinds of revenue in New York State through taxes through their port, and all these other states are getting none of it. They can't share in any kind of international trade treaties because New York has claimed it all for its own because of their advantageous position. Similarly, different states have different ideas of what their borders are, and they're starting to have the possibility of wars with each other, jurisdictional disputes that nobody can say who's right. And when you have a situation where nobody can decide who's right, it usually gets ended by the strongest. Might is right. That is a lawless situation, right? The other thing you have, of course, is the West. Like Washington had gone out and seen these people. How can you make sure these people remain part of the Union? How can you expand the population in a way where law and order can expand with the population so it doesn't lead to anarchy and it doesn't lead to the possibility of spin-off republics? We get a spin-off republic created in the 1780s, which really began in the end of the American Revolutionary War. It's called Vermont today. It was originally thought of as part of New York State or part of the New Hampshire grants. And what happened was a group of folks in those grants declared themselves a free and independent state of Vermont. They wrote their own constitution. They actually threatened to become back into the British Empire or have their independence protected by the British. And so they were a completely illegal separation from the United States, and ultimately Vermont is brought in, as we know, as one of the United States. But its origin is a revolutionary separation. And why can't you do that? Because that's how the United States themselves were born in revolution. And so there's another state, for those of you who live in Tennessee or live in North Carolina or know that area, the Smoky Mountains, that area was originally called the state of Franklin because a group of people who moved out there declared their independence from North Carolina. So what's the difference between Vermont and Franklin? How come we don't have the state of Franklin in the United States of America? Well, we don't have a state of Franklin because North Carolina sent an army that defeated the people in Franklin. But Franklin wrote a constitution. They had a state constitution. They did marriages. They had law. They had all kinds of things. They had a bunch of Revolutionary War heroes as the leaders of the state of Franklin. And of course, it ultimately gets put down by North Carolina. And in fact, some of those leaders of the Franklin movement will go on to become leaders of Tennessee when that's created later in the 1790s. So it's a remarkable period because it speaks to what might have happened in the United States. And I think you see this if you study in all the Latin American revolutions of the 19th century when the Spanish Empire breaks up. Why isn't there one big United States of Latin America? Well, partly, of course, because Brazil was Portuguese and not Spanish. And so you have separate languages and different cultures and traditions and different trajectories. But there was an effort, in some of those early independence movements in Spanish America to create big unions, confederations. Gran Granada was one of them, which united Colombia as well as Venezuela and some parts of Central America into one grand united collection of republics. But of course, it didn't hold together. It fell apart. They weren't able to create a stronger, more perfect union. And similarly, you would have seen that happen in North America. You would have had the Franklins. God knows what would have happened in the Ohio Valley ultimately. Because without the ability to project power, to form armies, to negotiate diplomacy, to have trade, to have a unified standard of laws, the strongest colonies would have been able to create their own distance from each other. And so we think about this period of the 1780s often as a critical period in American history. So the critical period was a name, actually it was often called the crisis in George Washington's own letters, and we'll talk about that. But a critical period was the name given to it by John Fiske, who's a historian who lived in the 19th century. And Fiske, who has the very sad, well, if you look up his Wikipedia page, one thing you'll see about Fiske is his cause of death was overwork. Which as a historian, I'm always quite fearful that I don't want to be the second historian to die from overwork, but Fiske it has that distinction. But anyway, he created the idea of the critical period, which is this separate moment in American history. Fiske lived through the American Civil War, but he said the critical period was the most important moment in the American destiny because without it, we would have been a squabbling collection of independent republics and principalities rather than a nation at all. And so that's the story of George Washington's leadership in the 1780s that I want to get to. All right, let me take a quick breather. And does Matt have a question, or is he just looking at me? Yeah, give me a question, and then we'll get into the Constitutional Convention. And what is this? How are they going to change their government?
So Doug, Rob wants to know, who would George Washington have considered his closest advisors during the process of forming the United States?
Okay, good. Really good question. So who would have Washington considered his closest advisors? Well, we kind of know this because so what happens is in the 1785, Washington creates this Potomac Navigation Company working closely with James Madison. They're all talking about the problems with the Articles of Confederation. They can't get anything done. And they're in danger of losing the independence that they had fought for. What's going to happen? Then you have a rebellion that breaks out in Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays. Shays' Rebellion, which is a tax revolt itself. It has a lot of connections to the way revolutionary fervor spread in pre-revolutionary Massachusetts in the 1760s and 70s. And so it's seen as very dangerous that all of a sudden you have thousands of men in arms begging for an overthrow of the Massachusetts government. And this is the real portent of worse to come because Massachusetts is one of the better run states in the Union. You've got all kinds of laws that have canceled debts. you've got no stability in the marketplace. You've got no international trade because you can't trade with the West Indies because it's British and they exclude you because of their navigation acts. And a lot of the commerce of New England, as well as parts of the South, were dependent upon the West Indies before the American Revolution. So there's no economy and no way to fix an economy. And so Washington is writing letters, sharing his concerns about the weakness of the Articles, worrying about the state of trade, worrying about anarchy. And so who is he writing to? He's writing to Henry Knox in Massachusetts. He's writing to John Jay, who still is in New York. He's working on the Articles of Confederation government. He's written the new Constitution for the state of New York. He's writing to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's involved in thinking about these issues. And he's writing to James Madison as well. So Madison, who we now know as the father of the Constitution, is actually working very close with George Washington at this time to build momentum for a movement to the Constitutional Convention. So once Washington agrees to go to the Constitutional Convention, which I'll talk about in a minute, he actually solicits from Jay, from Knox, and from Madison, what would be the elements of a government that we need to create? What are the key things that we need to create? And he took these 3 letters and he sort of took the best parts of each and put it into one document you can find in the papers of George Washington. I think it's in April and May, maybe March of 1787. So he's preparing to go to Philadelphia at this time. He's sort of organizing his own thoughts. What are the key things we need this government to be able to do, to be strong enough to survive, to be able to project power, to be able to act collectively, but at the same time allow the states to govern their own internal polities. And so you can see his mind at work, looking for advice. And then we also know Madison stops at Mount Vernon on the way to Philadelphia, and the Virginians kind of go together to the convention in Philadelphia, at least some of them do. And they're in Philadelphia a full week before the Constitutional Convention begins, maybe even a couple of weeks. And they get close together with the Pennsylvanians, including Franklin and some others, John Dickinson and some others, and they work together with ideas about how to manage this whole process, which I'll talk about in a minute. Before I get to that, though, I did want to mention this question of, well, how did they convince George Washington to actually go to the Constitutional Convention? Because remember the vine and fig tree and all that, right? He wanted to go under his vine and fig tree and never deal with the bustle of a camp or the intrigue of a court no more. And he made this promise. I, George Washington, promise you, the American people, I will no longer be involved in public affairs. And so he was very concerned that if he came out from Mount Vernon to go to something like a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, that he would be seen as someone who broke his word, someone who was hungry for power, someone who was ambitious, someone who, after all, was going to play the role of Cromwell. He's a dangerous man in the minds of a lot of people, or at least he believes they think he's dangerous, because so many other popular men who are so well known seize the reins of power and abuse it. And Washington wants to make sure that he won't be thought of in that manner. Ultimately, there's a really, a long series of letters where it's sort of like, will he, won't he come? And I have to admit, even I get annoyed reading Washington sort of, tearing at his breast, tearing his hair out. Oh, what will they think of me if I go back into public power? Of course, I have the benefit of hindsight to know that it all works out okay for you, George Washington, but he didn't have that. And he's a human being. And he is very concerned about his reputation. And it can only go badly for him. I mean, he has done it. He's a famous man, famous for giving up power, famous for winning the war. And so what does he have to gain? He has nothing to gain in terms of his own fame and reputation. All he could happen is, it's more likely than not that this will be a fiasco and none of these reforms will work. And then he'll just look like an idiot who came out of retirement and wasn't able to do anything, and all the worst case scenarios still happen. But Washington was a man of parts and courage and understood ultimately that he alone had the national authority and reputation to give substance to an effort, an honest effort to reform the Articles of Confederation, to make them stronger, to make them more enduring, so that all that they fought for was not lost. All right, question.
Question coming in from Joy. Besides Washington, who is your favorite minor character from this time period?
Besides Washington, who is my favorite minor character from this time period? Boy, that is a really good one. I guess it depends on what you consider to be minor. I mean, a lot of Americans don't know that much about John Jay. John Jay is probably the most important forgotten founding father of them all. But I really like George Wythe is one of my favorites. In fact, once upon a time when I was a younger man with more creativity, I wanted to write a book about George Wythe. And Wythe is sort of, I kind of see him as the grandfather of the American Revolution in a way. He's a great lawyer. He's a professor of law at William & Mary. And he actually is the law mentor of Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, and also Henry Clay. I mean, in addition to many other lesser lights. I mean, he's one of the most important intellectual leaders of the Revolutionary era. He's a fascinating guy. He goes to the Continental Congress. He goes to the Constitutional Convention. He's the Chancellor of Virginia. So he's basically the head of their Supreme Court in independence. He helps write the Code of Laws of the new Republic of Virginia. He also is an advocate to end slavery. He frees his own slaves in Virginia in the 1780s, a very important role to play. And he also has a fascinating end of his life. He's murdered by a relative who wants his fortune. And it's an African-American woman in his household who knows this and can prove it that he's poisoned, but she's not allowed to testify in court because she's black. And so his heir gets away with this murder. So it's Wythe he's in a tremendous story. The problem with writing a great book about Wythe is that his papers don't survive. So you'd have to write his story basically by using everybody else's papers, sort of like a painter that paints everything around and reveals the absence. A really good biography of Wythe could do that right, because he's involved with the Revolution, natural rights, law, constitutionalism, the founding fathers, race, slavery, Virginia, through a really epic period in time. And it's really, he dies in the early 19th century. So he lives through that whole period, the 1760s throughout, and he's trusted by all the different founders in a remarkable way. Because you think about Jefferson and John Marshall, they hate each other, and they both learn from Wythe. So Wythe is an interesting figure, and Henry Clay, of course, who goes on to become such an important figure in American politics well into the 19th century. So you think about the impact of Wythe, from the beginning of the Revolution all the way into the politics of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. I mean, it's a really tremendous legacy. All right, so let's get back to the main event. Speaking of constitutionalism, so Washington and the Virginians, James Madison, they have a Virginia plan. They decide very early on that they're not just going to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they're going to propose a new government. And this is dramatic. In fact, this is something George Washington insisted on. He said, if we are going to do this, let's not do it by half measures. It was evident to him that the Articles wasn't going to work. And by this point, the United States statesmen had upwards of 15 years of experience writing constitutions and getting constitutions put into law in the states. The states had been, as they've always been, this tremendous laboratory of political science and law. Throughout our history, the states have often been innovators in ways, and they certainly were through the Revolutionary period. The written constitutions of the American states, their bills of rights, these were world transformational documents that were read all over Europe. They were read all over Latin America. This was an incredibly vibrant, innovative period in thinking about how mankind could govern itself differently, could agree to rules that would govern themselves, and those rules would be fundamental and couldn't be changed except in extraordinary circumstances, constitutional law. This is a thing invented in this period. It's really quite remarkable, really separating the sense of a constitutional fundamental law, and in case a written constitution, from the normal course of statutory legislative law that's passed in each, when each session comes together, that you can change every time they come together. And that distinction was a really crucial one in the way human beings thought about the way to have a self-governing, sustainable, just society. Anyway, so they knew they could write a new constitution for the whole. And it's going to be a political problem because it's kind of revolutionary. It's illegal to do that, for one thing. They didn't have permission to meet in Philadelphia and come up with a new form of government. They're essentially traitors to the Articles, although they're going to spin that a different way later on and they're going to get permission after the fact, ask for forgiveness rather than get permission up front, because they didn't really know what they would end up with. And they had the Virginia Plan, which is going to be presented by Edmund Randolph, but written in large part by the Virginians and James Madison in particular, who'd been studying all different ancient constitutions and modern constitutions, all different kinds of leagues and confederations, and trying to come up with ones that would last and would work for the United States. And the Virginia Plan was therefore a new government. So the Constitutional Convention, once they settle on who's going to be the president of the convention, George Washington is named by Benjamin Franklin, because Franklin really is the only other man who has the national and international reputation to be in that role. And if you didn't see the great conversation between Kevin Butterfield and Ed Larson last night looking at Washington and Franklin, he has a good conversation in there about Franklin and Washington at the Constitutional Convention together and how they played off this role of sort of the wise old Franklin and the strong national George Washington figure, and how they work together. So Washington's placed in the chair and the convention begins. Now, they decide very early on they're going to write a new constitution. They're not just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. That drives some people away, actually. The New York delegates leave fairly early on and go back to New York and say that this is a disaster. These guys are trying to overthrow the government. The one exception is Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, gives a speech very early on in the Constitutional Convention in which he says that we should have Senate for life and a president for life, and we needed a monarchy-ish kind of stuff. We needed the strong parts of the British Constitution. And then he went back to New York, actually, to counteract the negative propaganda of these other New York delegates who were at the Constitutional Convention. But there's three big compromises that are going to be established during the Constitutional Convention that are essential to understand both what they agreed on and what they disagreed on. These different delegates from all the different states coming together to think about how do we create a new constitution. Any questions, Matt, on any of the compromises? Let me bleed into this.
How much, Adam would like to know, how much did the fact that Washington was obviously going to be the first influence with the framers structuring presidency?
Yeah, the question is about Washington's influence in the structure of the presidency. But let's put that aside for a second, because let's first look at the kind of general shape of things. The biggest controversy of this whole effort is to figure out, they knew they would have some kind of representative body that would have authority to pass laws for the whole in certain spheres, and they will argue about those as well. But what would that body comprise of? Now, the Articles of Confederation, is a body that gave each state one vote, which of course gives small states the same weight as the biggest states in major decisions. And the large states wanted to abandon this entirely. Madison's Virginia Plan, often called the Large State Plan, had the idea that there'd be a national Congress that would come together and they would pass laws based on the proportionality of population. Representation of each state would be on proportionality. So there'd be a true national legislature, which would represent the people. And of course, the small states didn't want anything to do with this. Why would they give up all the power that they had in the Articles of Confederation so that they could be dominated by Virginia and Massachusetts and some of the largest populations? Ultimately, as we know, the compromise was between some of the small state New Englanders and the Virginians, led by George Washington, involved in helping to craft the compromise, which had the two houses of government, an upper house in the Senate and a lower house, which would be represented differently. So the upper house would represent the states equally, with two members from each state, and the lower house would represent the people by population base. So that was the first great compromise. And it's really quite an interesting innovation, but it made everybody feel like, okay, this would be a government where we would be able to share representation. The other question became really about slavery, fundamentally. because it goes back to the question of, well, how do you count population for terms of representation and also for taxation? So for representational purposes, of course, if you're a southern state like South Carolina, you want to count all the enslaved people as equivalent to one person. So your population gives you that much more authority. But of course, none of those people would be able to vote. They wouldn't be able to hold office. They're enslaved. And so really all that authority goes to the slave owners. It doesn't really extend to everybody in the state. And of course, the northern states by this point were either getting rid of slavery very rapidly, very few slaves there, or they were gone entirely. And they thought that was ludicrous to count the slaves as equal population. And so they wanted them not to be counted at all. You don't count your houses and your other property in your representation. So why would you count what's essentially property in representation in this case? And so this was really, this would have split the Union if this couldn't be figured out. Constitution never would have gotten written, it never would have gotten ratified if there was no way to figure out how to represent enslaved people or property in people in this Constitution. And so they came up with a compromise, which everybody agreed was ludicrous and illogical and didn't make any sense, which is that you would count for every 5 slaves would be counted as 3 free people. So that's the 3/5 clause, right? So you have 5 slaves, we'll count them as 3 free people for the purposes of representation of how many people in the House of Representatives, how many electors, and also for the purposes of taxation. That's the flip side. The ability of South Carolina, when they decide what they owe on a certain tax, it'll be based on the 3/5 of people as well, because the enslaved people do add quite a bit to the tax base. So South Carolina has to pay more than if you just counted free people, right? So it's a compromise in that sense that the slave states will pay more than they would have if they didn't count the slaves, but they'll also get more representation. And sadly, of course, the way it's structured, the more slaves you have, the more representation you get. So it's in these areas where slavery is most entrenched that they will have the most power in that system. And it's really one of the things that ultimately is going to make people very upset with the Constitution into the 19th century. The other great compromise had to do with the control over trade policy. So all the New England states and the Middle Atlantic states knew that New York State had created in the 1780s a policy which really affected their ability to have trade, because New York was getting all the trade through the Port of New York, and they were charging other states to use the port, and they were also, getting all their own tax revenue for themselves, even if these products ultimately ended up in New Jersey or in Connecticut or anywhere. The port is in New York City. The stuff might be destined to go to, somewhere on New Bedford, Massachusetts, or somewhere close, and yet they had to pay more there than they would in New York to sell the stuff. So it's not a fair deal, and they wanted to give the power to create trade deals and to have one unified trade policy to this new national government that's being created under the Constitution. Southern states didn't like this very much because they're exporters of staple products, wheat, rice in South Carolina, tobacco, ship goods, tar and pitch in North Carolina. And these are things with lots of markets all over the world. And they learned from the example of the British experience that they don't want to have to depend on some distant legislature to tell them where they can sell their tobacco. You're going to tell me that I can only sell my tobacco in these different places? No. What was independence for? It was to break out of the British mercantile system, right? So now we're going to give another, centralizing authority this power? No. They didn't like that at all. And so if there was going to be a national power, some people wanted it to be a supermajority of votes in Congress that were required. So like 2/3 of a vote in Congress to create a commercial law, essentially, for the whole nation. That was one of the things, for instance, that George Mason was advocating here in Virginia, and when he was at the Constitutional Convention. But there was a deal that was struck between the northern states, who were commercial states, who wanted a unified commercial policy to be passed by simple majorities, in the House and Senate, and the southern states, particularly South Carolina and a little bit of North Carolina, mostly South Carolina, who wanted to keep the slave trade going. The slave trade, as you know, in the Constitutional Convention is limited, or it gives the power of the Congress to get rid of the international slave trade after 20 years. And that 20-year extension period was the deal that was struck so that they would support the idea of a simple majority to create commercial trade laws. So these are the three big compromises that secured a general government. Without those three compromises, you wouldn't have had ratification in the states. South Carolina would have walked away. New York already hated it because the New Yorkers had left the convention. Massachusetts was maybe an iffy question. And so the Virginians were trying to figure out a way, led by Washington's team, essentially, with Madison on the floor and Washington in the chair, trying to make sure these compromises made sure the Union would last. Because what Washington really wanted, he wasn't going to quibble over the 3/5 clause here or this policy there. He wanted a unified government that could raise an army and pay for it, that could have a unified national foreign policy, that could create unified commercial regulations, and that would assure that there would be basically a free trade zone within the states. The states can't create their own laws to mess up the economy, essentially. That contracts would be honored, that ex post facto laws could not be passed. You couldn't charge someone with a crime if it wasn't a crime at the time they committed it. All these things were the essential things that he wanted, and that's what he wanted to get. So the ends were the things they wanted. And in fact, the rest of the Constitutional Convention is really fighting over the details of those things. You're going to have a unified naturalization law. You're going to have a unified bankruptcy law. You're going to have the federal government can be the only government that can coin money. You're creating a national economic and foreign policy unity amongst these different states. So you're creating some centralized authority in areas where it's important for the states to work outwardly and in unison, to secure their borders, to protect their frontiers, to raise their armies, to have a flourishing economy, and you're allowing the states themselves to manage their internal polities. So that's essentially the Constitution that we get. Now, the question, to get back to it, was about the presidency, right? So the presidency is really interesting because it's very powerful. Article 1 of the Constitution lays out the Congress, where a lot of these compromises had to happen and a lot of the debate happened. Article 2 lays out the executive branch. So the Americans by this time have a pretty strong sense of political science. John Jay, for instance, writes to George Washington before the Constitutional Convention. He says, "Let some legislate, let others execute, and let others judge." The three different powers of government, of legislation, execution, and judgment. And so these three different functions were intended to be separated from each other into different branches of government. And so the Americans are going to do that. So the legislation is seen as the most important because that is what creates the law. It's what represents the people. The executive is also very important. Originally, they argued about this. Should they have a unitary executive, president, or should they have some kind of a triumvirate? The Romans did that. The great triumvirate. Should they have a council of some kind? I mean, some of the state constitutions at this time still had councils and not governors. Maybe a council is safer, where you could get one person from each section of the union, represented north, middle, and south, or west too. Maybe you could have 5 on there. A council of leaders. No, ultimately, a unitary executive was seen as the most effective. And that brought out the idea of the danger of monarchy, right? They had just fought against a monarch. If you have one man as the head of the government, won't they just become like a monarch? And this is where there was some struggle. But ultimately, Pierce Butler, as a delegate from South Carolina, says famously, we wouldn't have given the authority to the executive in such a grand manner if we hadn't been looking at the example of George Washington. Because Article 2 of that Constitution, remember I said Article 1 is the legislative branch, Article 2 is the executive branch. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. It is a great granting of power. The Congress is limited in the kinds of laws they can create, and they're not in term all the time. The judiciary branch, which is created in Article 3, are also limited to what kind of federal laws they have jurisdiction of. And it was quite limited, actually, in the Constitution itself. And the judicial power would be defined by legislation. But Washington's executive power is 365 days a year. It's vested, and he has powers that aren't limited or restricted in any way. So trusting that George Washington would be a man to use power carefully, that he would bind himself to the rule of law, was something that that the delegates trusted of George Washington in the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so other questions then. So the presidency, you know, what's not in, and I'll give a plug for one of my friends, Lindsay Chervinsky out there, which I think we're going to have a book talk with her at some point, I hope in the future. She has a brand new book which dropped yesterday called The Cabinet. And one of the functions actually that's very important to the executive branch today and the way we think about the powerful in the American government, the cabinet members, it's not even in the Constitution. It's not listed in the Constitution. Because again, Article 2, they don't really talk about it much. I mean, they're fighting over representation and proportionality and all this stuff. Article 2 is sort of put together and they don't really think through a lot of how it will actually function, or at least they feel like they don't need to put that into the fundamental law. Presidents can shape how they manage the affairs of state, essentially. And Washington creates the idea of the cabinet as a regular consulting body. Because in the Constitution, the framers sort of have, you know, they have the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War listed. There's going to be an Attorney General. Now, those are the bare bones of what we call the cabinet. But all it says in the Constitution is that he, meaning the president, can from time to time request the advice of these ministers in the government by writing. It says by writing in the Constitution. So does that mean you can't request their advice other ways? I mean, it certainly doesn't set up the idea that the cabinet is going to be this advisory body. In fact, the framers think the Senate is going to play that role. The Senate is, you know, has advice and consent in the treaty-making power. So they take executive power and they mingle it with the legislative branch, right? So, and that's the mixing of powers in our constitutional design. So separate, mixed. You separate legislative, executive, and judiciary, but you mix them together. The judges are appointed by the president, but judicial power is laid by legislation. Treaties are ratified by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So mixing again, and the idea that the Senate is going to be this more stable body of wise men. You know, they have 6-year terms. They're appointed by the state legislatures originally. They are going to help the president really run the foreign policy of the country. Now we see, of course, in practice, George Washington in the presidency doesn't do that. And I'll talk about that a little next time when we look at the presidency. He goes a different direction and ends up with his cabinet. But I encourage you all to go get Lindsay's book or connect with her on Twitter and see if she'll send you a signed copy for a little bit of cash. That leads me to another thing, actually, while we're doing this. I've only got a few minutes left. I very much appreciate whatever support you can do for Mount Vernon during these times. We're having a sale online, 20% off of our great goods in Mount Vernon, including a copy of George Washington's own Constitution, the Acts of Congress, which I'll talk about next time. But also, we have the opportunity for you to become members of Mount Vernon. We're giving away a free family membership thanks to the Hamill family of Arizona, to a lucky commentator on our Facebook page. But you also can buy a membership for yourself or for someone and become part of the Mount Vernon family. Think of all the great educational work that we've been doing during this shutdown period. And it's important now as ever for us to see that support. You also can, of course, as you hear all the time from your public radio stations, you can send in a donation to Mount Vernon. And it really is crucial right now. It goes directly to support of our staff and the benefits for our staff so that we can try to get through this crisis as a whole entity. And I appreciate personally any kind of sacrifice you make in that way. I know this is a time of insecurity for a lot of us, and we don't know when it will end and what it will look like on the other time. And so those of you who do have some security financially or in your income, please think about us as a place that could use your help. Give me a question, Matt, please.
Yeah. So Dan would like to know, what part of the new Constitution do you think Washington was most opposed to, or at least in support of?
Yeah, a really good question. What parts of the Constitution were Washington the most opposed to? It's hard to know. Washington didn't say anything publicly at the Constitutional Convention except for one point. There might be two and one small, but one of the ones that's important, at the very end, they were arguing about the number of people that would be represented by one member of the House of Representatives. And they were arguing over whether it should be 40,000 or if that was too many. So if you have one representative for 40,000 people, the idea is that, well, that will be an important man who will have a certain amount of wealth. So the more people they represent means the less democratic, essentially, the institution will be. The less people in there. And Washington actually advocated that it be 30,000. He thought 40,000 was too restrictive and that we needed to be more representative in the House of Representatives, not less representative. So if anybody says that Washington was anti-democratic, they have to justify why the only time he comes out to say something during the Constitutional Convention was to make the Constitution more democratic. They have a hard level to pass there. And it's an important place. I think there probably were things in the Constitution that he didn't like. In fact, when he writes and sends the Constitution to the Marquis de Lafayette, he sends it to people in Europe. He writes to people who weren't there. And he says it's not perfect, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances, and he does think it will be good. I think that's really important. And again, I think we go back to that list of things that George Washington thought was essential for any new government to be able to have: the ability to tax individuals, to create a unified foreign policy, to create a unified commercial, to create unified naturalization processes, and to be able to project power. Those are the things that are in there. I mean, he got basically what he wanted. A lot of the rest is window dressing, how the actual decisions would be made, the checks and balances and all that. Washington wasn't a theorist in the way that Madison was. He wanted a certain outcome, a certain government that had a certain kind of strength, a certain kind of centralization, and he got it. And so that's, I think, the thing to remember about Washington and the Constitution. In fact, Madison doesn't get a lot of what he advocates. He, in the Virginia Plan, he advocates that the National Representative Assembly should have a veto over state authority. He doesn't get that. He advocates for all kinds of things that don't end up in the actual Constitution. George Washington ultimately looks like he gets the Constitution he wants rather than Madison getting everything he wants. And you'll remember that Madison ultimately, when push comes to shove and it starts getting political, he ultimately abandons the administration of George Washington and goes into opposition. And so it's not at all clear that he is as in love with the Constitution as George Washington is. I do want to say something about the ratification process and George Washington's role. Now, he's in a very important role here because once they get the Constitution written, Washington, as the president of the convention, sends it to the Continental Congress for approval to be submitted to the states. It has to be submitted to the states for ratification. And if the Continental Congress says, no, you guys, this is illegal, we didn't give you the right to do this, we're not sending it anywhere, that would have been the end of it, unless there would have been some more aggressive coup or something like that. But Washington's authority was such that he wrote the letter that said, herein is this new Constitution. I'd like you to consider it. Then the Continental Congress couldn't oppose George Washington in this way. So Washington gives the whole thing wind. He blows into the sails of this new ship of state and sets it off into the ratification process. And a lot of people say, well, George Washington didn't write one of the Federalist essays or something like that. But you know what he did do? He wrote this letter to the Continental Congress. And every time the Constitution is published in a newspaper over the period of the ratification, it's accompanied with this letter from George Washington saying that this is something we should do. And that, the stamp of approval is as important as any Federalist paper that was ever written.
So, Doug, a question from Bonnie. What do you think was the biggest contradiction in the new Constitution?
Bonnie asked, what is the biggest contradiction in the Constitution? The biggest contradiction is the institution of slavery is sort of it's dealt with, but not dealt with. It's never mentioned. The 3/5 clause talks about the condition of servitude. It doesn't say slaves, and the international slave trade is not mentioned. So, it's clear that these guys, they're somewhat embarrassed about that institution in a document that's intended to enshrine the values of liberty that they had won their independence for. Remember, remember the Declaration's opening, the preamble. We hold these truths as self-evident, that all men are created equal, that governments are created to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a new government they're creating. It's intended to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They all believe that, but yet it has slavery wedded into it and embedded in it in ways that are ultimately going to really, as the politics changes, it's really going to strengthen the institution of slavery as a political player in the national government. On the other hand, unlike those historians who want to talk about this as a pro-slavery document, which it isn't, and I think it's clearly not a pro-slavery constitution, because the Articles of Confederation would never have been able to end slavery anywhere. In fact, it wouldn't have been able to enforce the restrictions on slavery in the Northwest Territories. It wouldn't have been able to stop the slave states from spreading all over the country. There would have been no Fugitive Slave Act. There would have been no Dred Scott case or anything like that. There would have been slavery probably almost everywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. So the Articles of Confederation was more pro-slavery than the Constitution. So you can't go from one to another. And I do think that that attitude is an attitude of radical abolitionists, which some people agree with. I personally think it's much more complicated than that, and that the intentions of the framers in the moment in 1787, when they don't know anything about the cotton gin, and they don't know anything about a potential slave trade from the upper South to the lower South, none of that exists. And they have a notion that slavery is going to be disappearing. They couldn't have been more wrong, but none of us can predict the future.
So Doug, just time for about 3 more questions. Vicki would like to know, where would indentured servants fall in regards to the 3/5 Compromise and the Constitution?
Where would indentured servants fit in terms of the 3/5 Compromise? That's a really good question. And the way it's written, I think they would be counted as 3/5. Of course, they're only temporarily in that position, and indentured servitude is disappearing rapidly in the 1790s. It's almost an institution that disappears. The other thing to think about in terms of servitude is not all of the states allowed universal suffrage at this time. So the states, were guaranteed a Republican government by the Constitution, whatever that meant, because some of these, not only could women not vote in the vast majority of states, there was a loophole in New Jersey that lasted into the early 19th century where women did vote. That's a really tremendously interesting story, but only propertied women, because there was a class limitation of voting. So most people who were in servitude could not vote. No matter what color, ethnicity, the length of servitude were. In fact, in many laws, they couldn't marry without the permission of their master. They couldn't do anything without the permission of their master. So servitude in the 18th century context is not an employee-employer relationship. It's much deeper than that, and it's much more restrictive. So it's a really good question. Paupers couldn't vote, criminals couldn't vote. I mean, there's all kinds of people that couldn't vote. In this period, their notion of representative democracy will be evolving, and rapidly in the 1790s. By 1820, your 1830s and 20s, you're getting almost universal manhood suffrage for white men as black men lose the vote that they had earlier. So it's a complicated moment when Americans are going to fight over what does democracy mean through this period.
Doug, Lori would like to know, did Washington ever get angry at the Constitutional Convention?
Question is, did Washington ever get angry at the Constitutional Convention? I think Washington was likely bored a lot at the Constitutional Convention, more than angry. Although if you can imagine in the sweltering heat in July, you're trapped in this house. They close all the windows and doors, so nobody can know what's going on, because they don't want gentlemen performing for the press, essentially. We have a politics in which public opinion is essential to it. They had public opinion at the time too, which was powerful, but they were worried that people wouldn't feel free to say what they really meant in making these deals and in talking about what they're worried about, if they knew that everything they were saying was going to be reported in the press. So Washington's up there in the chair, sweltering heat, trapped inside the room in Philadelphia. But he actually had a vibrant social life in the evenings. He would go eat with his good friend Elizabeth Willing Powell and her husband, the mayor of Philadelphia. He would often have people over to eat with him. He didn't stay in the boarding house. He stayed with the Powells. Most of the delegates were in the boarding house. And in fact, Ed Larson, in his book on Washington, The Return of George Washington, emphasizes that George Washington would often have dinner with people that would lead the compromise conversations the next day, so that he would have strategic dinners with people from different states and talk through some of the compromises that they needed to get figured out. And as the chair at the Constitutional Convention, he picked who spoke, right? So he could orchestrate who got a chance to speak first and lead the debate, essentially. And I think Washington's influence on the Constitutional Convention itself is much more powerful than it looks at first glance. But did he get angry? I don't have any evidence that he was angry during that. He was angry as president quite a bit.
And last question, Doug. Dario would like to know who else helped George Washington to form the United States?
Oh, great question, Daria. Who else helped George Washington form the United States? First off, it's a tremendous success of the people of the United States, men and women of all races who were involved in different ways in this whole period. The ratification of the Constitution itself is a tremendous story of popular approval, because these ratification conventions often got rid of a lot of the restrictions on the right to vote, and more people voted or were able to vote for the ratification conventions than even in the normal run of affairs. But beyond that, the debate in the newspapers, and it's a peaceful thing. That's what's really extraordinary. The United States transitions to a completely new government without violence and without war, and that government still exists today. Our Constitution is the longest lasting written constitution in the world, and it has its issues, and it was designed to require compromise, and that's why often we don't see the different factions of government working together effectively and constantly berating each other, and deadlock and constitutional tricks and parliamentary tricks in the House. But you notice what happened in a period of real crisis. This incredible multi-trillion-dollar CARES Act was passed unanimously and put through the two houses together. So it's a government designed to be able to manage crises and rise together when the public good is clear. But it's also intended to balance different interests across different regions, across different ideas, in a way that requires compromise to move government along. So we all have a role to play in its successes and in its failures. We all can be blamed. We get the government that we demand. We self-govern. We are a nation that runs itself. And so we think about the government and the people as separate things, but the people are the government, and the government responds to the people. And so that, I think, should give us all strength in a moment of national challenge. We have the tools to come together as a people at a lot of different levels. We have the tools to do great things together, and we always have in the midst of crises. As I'm often reflecting on all the great moments in American history, from the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, the American Civil War, the World War II, the Civil Rights Movement. There's huge failures in all of these successes. Embedded in them is venality and corruption and mistakes and lack of vision and things that would go on to have negative consequences. So too it is as we are taking on this really unprecedented health crisis in American history. And we're going to come through it together with great success. And there'll be some stumbles along the way, but we need to be patient with each other. We need to be patient to learn more about what's happening and make decisions in an environment of strength rather than a panic, and we'll be fine. And so my best wishes go out to all you that are having a challenge right now, and I hope very much that you keep tuning into Mount Vernon. Support us as an educational institution that's doing good work for the country. Thank you so much.